It was a bright, promising morning when I, Evelyn, and my younger brother Ziair, just 12 years old, stepped into the gleaming first-class cabin with hearts full of anticipation. We clutched our tickets tightly, marveling at the spacious, luxurious seats and the quiet elegance that surrounded us. We had never experienced such comfort before, and every detail of the flight promised a little escape from the ordinary. However, our excitement was soon shattered by the cold scrutiny of a flight attendant whose eyes, scanning the cabin, fixed on us with a look that was anything but welcoming. As she strode over with determined steps, there was no warmth in her voice when she abruptly ordered, "You need to move, now." In that moment, my heart pounded with both confusion and a creeping sense of dread. I exchanged a worried glance with Ziair, whose bright, eager eyes quickly dulled with uncertainty at the sound of her harsh command. I tried to steady my trembling voice as I explained, "Yes, these are our seats," while offering up our tickets. Yet the attendant's expression only darkened, and I couldn't shake the feeling that she had already made up her mind about us. Her grip on the tickets tightened, and there was a distinct edge in her tone that suggested this wasn't a simple mix-up. As whispers began to ripple through the cabin, I felt an overwhelming injustice, like we were being punished for something we hadn't even done. It wasn't just the inconvenience of being asked to move, it was the sense of being targeted by a person who seemed to relish in making us feel out of place. I wondered silently if her hostility was born from a personal vendetta rather than a clerical error, and that thought sent a shiver down my spine. Before I could gather my thoughts, another attendant appeared, a stern, silver-haired gentleman named Mr. Hensley. With a firm, unyielding tone, he informed us that we had to step out of first class for a quick check on our tickets. His calm, emotionless delivery did nothing to soothe my rising anxiety. Instead, it only deepened the pit in my stomach. Ziair's earlier excitement was now completely replaced by fearful compliance. As he clutched his small backpack, his eyes wide and uncertain, I could feel my pulse racing as I realized that this was not an isolated incident of confusion, but rather the opening salvo of a situation that was rapidly spiraling into something far more painful and personal. I recalled with vivid clarity the feeling of being singled out, of standing in a brightly lit cabin while every whisper and sideways glance from other passengers seemed to condemn us without reason. I knew that our father, Darius Holloway, a man of unwavering principles who had arranged this treat for us, would never have approved of such mistreatment. His reputation for calm, precise handling of even the most delicate issues was legendary. Yet in that moment, his absence felt like an added cruelty. With every second that passed, the tension in the air thickened until a uniformed security officer approached, his gaze cold and calculating, as if we were the source of a problem that demanded immediate resolution. Desperation surged through me as I fumbled for my phone, dialing my father's number with shaking hands. When he answered, my voice came out in a broken whisper, "Dad, they just kicked us off the plane." His measured response, delivered with a quiet authority that belied the storm brewing beneath the surface, instructed us to stay put and not to speak to anyone. That moment was both a comfort and a curse. While I trusted his ability to set things right, his calm command only underscored the gravity of what was happening. It wasn't merely a bureaucratic error. It was a deliberate act of humiliation executed by those who seemed to derive satisfaction from our misery. As we were escorted out of the first-class cabin, I could feel the weight of every judgmental glance from other passengers. The once inviting terminal now felt like an arena of silent condemnation. I clutched Ziair's hand, trying to offer him a semblance of comfort, even as my own heart ached with a mix of anger and sorrow. The hostile stares, the indifferent whispers, and the looming presence of security officers, all of it combined to create an atmosphere of isolation and injustice that I will never forget. My mind raced with questions. Why were we being treated as if we had committed some grave offense? Why did it feel so personal? as though the attendant's disdain was fueled by an old grudge rather than a simple error. I couldn't shake the memory of the flight attendant's steely gaze, the way her eyes flickered with a malicious certainty that she was in the right, that we were undeserving of even a moment of comfort. It wasn't long before she returned, this time accompanied by Mr. Hensley, whose icy demeanor only reinforced the harshness of her actions. Her voice, low and menacing, left no room for negotiation when she warned us that we could either comply or have security called upon us. That choice, presented in such a brutal and uncompromising manner, made it painfully clear that she intended to humiliate us publicly. I felt a surge of defiance, mingled with deep sadness, as I realized that every moment spent in that degrading predicament was chipping away at the dignity I had so carefully nurtured. In the midst of that ordeal, every second stretched into an eternity. I remember Ziair's small voice questioning why we had to move, his innocent confusion making the situation all the more heart-wrenching. His words, barely audible over the murmurs of an increasingly agitated crowd, cut through me like a knife. I desperately wished I could shield him from the cruelty of it all, to somehow mend the injustice that had been thrust upon us in such a callous and calculated manner. Yet, as we were led further away from the plane, it became painfully evident that this was only the beginning of a conflict that would leave deep emotional scars. The palpable tension in the terminal, the cold stares of security officers, the indifferent glances of hurried travelers, and the undercurrent of disdain that seemed to seep from every corner, served as a stark reminder that we were now alone in facing an injustice far greater than a simple misunderstanding. Every detail of that day is etched into my memory. The way the attendant's tone dripped with contempt, the merciless efficiency with which Mr. Hensley enforced her orders, and the silent, condemning watch of the security officer who treated us as if we were criminals. I felt abandoned, humiliated, and painfully aware of the cruelty that can lurk behind the facade of authority. In that moment, I began to understand that our experience was not merely an unfortunate mishap, but the result of an underlying prejudice, a deep-seated animosity that had nothing to do with our tickets and everything to do with a vindictive desire to assert control. It was a bitter lesson in how appearances and biases could conspire to turn a joyful adjective into a nightmare. Even as I sat there, my heart heavy with grief and anger, I clung to the hope that my father's intervention would soon set things right. His voice over the phone had been calm and resolute, a promise that those responsible for this cruelty would soon face consequences. Yet the cold logic in his words did little to soothe the immediate pain of humiliation and fear that threatened to overwhelm me. I watched as Ms. Calloway and Mr. Hensley reboarded the plane without a backward glance, their faces set in expressions that betrayed neither remorse nor regret. Their actions, calculated and remorseless, only deepened the chasm of injustice that I felt widening around us. Even as the day wore on and the bustling airport terminal provided little comfort, I couldn't shake the memory of that moment when authority was wielded as a weapon against us. I realized that our struggle was not just about reclaiming a seat on a plane. It was about fighting against the cruelty of those who use their power to demean and devalue others. In that cold, indifferent space, I resolved that I would not let this experience break my spirit. I would remember the injustice not as a defeat, but as a call to stand up against cruelty, no matter how deep-rooted it might be. Even as the day ended and the cool night air replaced the stifling atmosphere of the terminal, I knew that this was not the end of our struggle. I could hear in my heart the faint echo of my father's promise, and in that echo lay the hope that someday justice would prevail and those who sought to harm the innocent would be held accountable. For now, I carried with me the bitter lessons of that day, a constant reminder that even in the midst of overwhelming cruelty, the spark of resilience and love for those we hold dear can never be extinguished. And to anyone who has ever felt small or powerless, I offer my deepest sympathy and a reminder that our strength lies in our ability to stand up for what is right, no matter how daunting the challenge may seem. I still remember that moment when everything took another harsh turn. I had barely caught my breath after the initial humiliation when a crisp voice from behind broke the silence. Ms. Calloway, whose icy demeanor had already made our ordeal unforgettable, answered a phone call that would shatter the fragile power she held over us. Mr. Denton, the gate supervisor, spoke in a measured tone as he informed her that they had just received a call from corporate with direct orders from my father, Darius Holloway. Hearing those words was like a splash of freezing water over her face. I could see her eyes narrow and her hand tighten on her clipboard as she tried to process the news. Mr. Denton's voice remained calm yet unyielding as he explained that corporate had intervened because of our removal from first class, a mistake that now threatened her very career. My heart sank a little deeper, knowing that the very man who had always stood for fairness was now forcing her to confront her error in the most public way possible. Ms. Calloway's expression shifted from cold authority to one of panic and reluctant submission. "Who is that?" Mr. Denton asked softly, lowering his voice so only those nearby could hear. He continued, "We just got a call from corporate. Direct orders from Darius Holloway." The name, my father's name, hit her like a ton of bricks. It was as if every ounce of her confidence drained away in that moment, leaving her vulnerable and exposed. I watched as she blinked, her face contorting in disbelief and dread. It was the first time in years that I had seen her falter so completely, and in that instant, I felt a surge of vindication mixed with sorrow. Her grip on the clipboard tightened even more as Mr. Denton calmly informed her that my father was personally involved now and demanded an explanation immediately. The gravity of the situation was not lost on anyone. I could feel the stares of passengers shifting from mild curiosity to outright judgment as they began to murmur amongst themselves. The atmosphere in the terminal was thick with tension, and every whispered word seemed to underline our collective humiliation. Ms. Calloway's face, usually so composed and impeccable, now betrayed the inner turmoil she was desperately trying to hide. With a shaky voice, she attempted to explain. "It was a simple misunderstanding. I had reason to believe their seats were a mistake, so I followed procedure and asked them to step out while we verified." But Mr. Denton's next question cut through her explanation like a knife. "Did you verify first or did you assume?" His words echoed in the charged silence, and for a moment, it seemed as if time itself had stalled. I felt a deep, gnawing sorrow for the injustice we had endured, and a fierce anger rising within me at the blatant abuse of power. Before I could process what was happening, Mr. Denton informed her that my father's private office had just sent new orders. "You will personally escort them back onto the plane, and you will issue an apology in front of the passengers," he said firmly. My stomach churned as I heard the command. How could she possibly muster the courage to apologize when her entire world was crumbling around her? And yet, the alternative, further humiliation and the potential explosion of a discrimination scandal, was unthinkable to the corporate brass. With a lump in her throat and a forced smile that did nothing to hide her inner defeat, she responded with a curt, "Of course, I'll take care of it." But as she turned to lead us back to the plane, I could see that every step she took was weighed down by the knowledge that she was about to face not only us, but an entire room full of witnesses to her disgrace. Inside the waiting area, the memory of what had just transpired still lingered like a heavy fog. I sat there, my arms crossed and my phone resting in my lap, while my younger brother Ziair fidgeted beside me. His sneakers tapped nervously on the floor as he stole anxious glances at the gate, where passengers continued to board as if nothing had happened. The stares and silent judgments of those around us cut deeply, making the already painful situation feel even more isolated. My phone buzzed with a message from my father, a terse reminder to stay put because they were coming back for us. I couldn't help but feel that his calm directive was also a promise that justice would soon be served, though it did little to ease the immediate sting of our mistreatment. Then, just as I was trying to steady my racing heart, I heard the clicking of heels approaching us. Ms. Calloway reappeared, walking toward us with a tight-lipped expression that barely concealed her inner anger. Her usual confidence was marred by the tension of the recent events, and as she stood before us, I sensed that her demeanor was now more a mask for fear than a reflection of authority. Ziair, always so sensitive to the undercurrents, straightened in his seat as if bracing himself, while I felt a mix of indignation and sorrow swell inside me. The sight of her forced composure made it painfully clear that she was struggling to keep her crumbling authority intact. Her voice came out strained and almost robotic as she began what was meant to be a formal apology. "Mr. Holloway? Ms. Holloway, there has been an oversight," she said, addressing us by my father's name in a clumsy attempt to restore some semblance of order. My eyes narrowed as I listened to her continued explanation, the words feeling empty and contrived. She stated that after reviewing the seating arrangements, it was confirmed that our tickets were correct and that we were welcome to return to our first-class seats. I remained still, my gaze locked on her face as I noticed the way her fingers curled tightly against her palm, and the slight tension in her shoulders betrayed her inner turmoil. It was then that I could no longer hold back the raw pain and anger inside me. I turned to her, and with a voice that was calm yet edged with a steely determination, I said, "We will go back, but I want to hear you admit it. I want to hear you say that you assumed we did not belong here." The silence that followed was heavy with expectation, and I could almost feel the collective breath of everyone in the cabin, waiting for her response. Her eyes flickered momentarily, and for a heartbeat I thought I saw the ghost of remorse in them. But then she inhaled sharply and, glancing briefly over her shoulder at Mr. Denton, who was watching her every move with crossed arms, she finally said through gritted teeth, "I made an assumption, and I was wrong." Her words, though delivered, felt hollow to me. They did nothing to erase the deep injustice we had suffered, nor did they alleviate the bitter memory of being treated like criminals. It was not a sincere apology, but a rehearsed line delivered under duress, a product of corporate coercion rather than genuine contrition. As we began the walk back toward the plane, escorted by Ms. Calloway herself, every step felt laden with the weight of our experience. The bright, elegant jet bridge that had once symbolized luxury and freedom now felt like a corridor of shame. I could see the change in the behavior of the other flight attendants. Their expressions grew stiff and their eyes averted, as if they too were ashamed of the spectacle. Even Mr. Hensley, standing by the door with his arms folded, greeted us in a monotone voice that conveyed little warmth. Ziair hesitated before stepping onto the plane, his eyes searching mine for reassurance, and I managed a small nod, though inside I was struggling to contain a storm of emotions. Once we were inside the first-class cabin, the atmosphere shifted again, this time into one of strained silence. Conversations dwindled to whispers, and every passenger seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for the inevitable fallout. I took my seat by the window, carefully adjusting my backpack as if trying to shield myself from the penetrating stares of those around us. Ziair sat more hesitantly than before, his small hands gripping the armrests as if they could somehow steady his trembling heart. I looked around at the rows of empty seats that had remained untouched, a silent testament to the injustice that had unfolded just moments before. Not long after we settled in, I overheard an older gentleman mutter from across the aisle, "It's about time." His voice was low, and though it was directed at Ms. Calloway, I sensed that his words were a thinly veiled commentary on the entire incident. I turned my gaze toward her, noticing that her face had lost some of its earlier bravado, replaced now by a pallid expression of discomfort and defeat. Before long, another voice, this one softer and laden with regret, emerged from a woman seated a few rows ahead, remarking that we should have never been asked to leave in the first place. Each comment, each whispered observation, only deepened the chasm between us and those who had wielded power so cruelly over our experience. Then, as if to add one final layer to our ordeal, a younger flight attendant named Hannah, whose red name tag stood out in stark contrast to the muted tones of the cabin, approached us cautiously. Her eyes flickered with a mixture of sympathy and uncertainty as she asked, "Would you like anything to drink before takeoff?" Her tone was gentler than what had come before, but even that small kindness could not erase the bitterness of our recent humiliation. I couldn't help but question her, in a quiet yet firm voice. "Did you ask everyone else that when they first sat down?" For a moment, her expression wavered, and she stuttered an explanation that revealed her own discomfort with the situation. It was a fleeting glimpse of truth that made me wonder how many others had silently suffered under the weight of unfair treatment. Every detail of that day remains etched in my memory. The cold, calculated cruelty of Ms. Calloway, the unyielding demands of corporate authority, and the piercing stares of a crowd that had witnessed our public shaming. Even though I tried to hold my head high and return to my seat, I could not shake the feeling that we were not simply passengers on a flight, but unwilling participants in a display of power gone terribly wrong. The experience left me with a profound sadness, a sense of injustice that was as personal as it was universal. I sat there, feeling small and vulnerable, yet determined that the pain of that day would not define me. I vowed that I would never allow such cruelty to pass unchallenged, even if it meant standing alone against an indifferent system. In the end, that flight became much more than a simple journey from one destination to another. It was a stark lesson in the dangers of unchecked authority and the importance of compassion in the face of cruelty. And while I still carry the scars of that experience, I also carry with me the quiet strength that comes from knowing I stood up for what was right, even when it meant facing the unrelenting cruelty of someone who had once seemed untouchable. I remember the quiet tension that filled the cabin when I finally broke the silence, answering in a soft tone, "Water, for both of us." Hannah, the young flight attendant with the red name tag, simply nodded and walked away, leaving me and my little brother, Ziair, to wonder if that small gesture meant anything. Ziair leaned toward me, his voice barely above a whisper as he asked, "Why did you ask that?" I replied, "Because she wants to make things right," though deep down, I knew that her actions had fallen far short of making any real amends when it mattered most. I could see the disappointment in Ziair's eyes as his excitement, once bubbling at the promise of new adventures on the in-flight screen, had evaporated, replaced with a heavy understanding that nothing was as it should be. Before I could even type a quick reply to my father's last reassuring message, "Stay put, they're coming back for you," the intercom crackled to life with an unexpected call. "Mrs. Calloway, please report to the cockpit immediately." I felt a chill as Ziair straightened in his seat, his small face anxious. I gripped my phone tighter. Something told me that Ms. Calloway's troubles were only just beginning. I watched her as she moved, her heels clicking sharply on the polished floor of the plane, each step filled with the weight of looming consequences. It was clear that the captain never summoned her to the cockpit unless the matter was very serious. As she reached the door, she paused, exhaled slowly, and stepped inside, leaving us behind in an eerie silence. Inside the cockpit, Captain Rowe, a man known for his years of experience and little patience for nonsense, sat with an unreadable expression while the first officer kept a steady eye on the controls. The tension was almost tangible, and I could tell that everyone there was aware of the storm brewing outside. The in-flight phone still glowed on the center console, and moments later, Ms. Calloway's voice trembled as she asked, "You asked for me?" Captain Rowe did not immediately look up. Instead, he pressed a button on the phone, switching it to speaker mode. A deep, controlled voice filled the small space. "Miss Calloway, this is Darius Holloway." The name struck her like a blow, and I felt my heart tighten with sympathy and righteous anger. Darius Holloway was not just any executive. He was the owner of the airline, the very man who had built this company from the ground up, and the father of the children Ms. Calloway had so callously humiliated. Captain Rowe leaned back, arms folded as if bracing himself for what was to come. "Mr. Holloway has a few questions for you," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. I could almost feel Ms. Calloway's hands trembling as she clutched them tightly together. Darius's next words cut through the silence. "Did you verify my children's tickets before asking them to move?" Her throat constricted, and she stammered, I was following protocol." The pause on the other end of the line was deafening, and I sensed Captain Rowe watching her closely, his disappointment evident in the slight twitch of his jaw. Then, in a measured tone that brooked no argument, Darius continued, "That's not what I asked." Ms. Calloway's voice faltered as she managed a weak, "No, sir." Another long pause ensued before Darius stated quietly, "So, you assumed they didn't belong in first class." Those words, spoken softly, yet with a weight that made her legs tremble, carried the full force of our injustice. "I misjudged the situation," she finally said, her voice barely steady as she tried to defend herself. But Darius was not finished. After a moment he asked, "And did you question any other first-class passengers the same way?" Her silence said it all. The truth lay bare in that unspoken admission. Captain Rowe shook his head slightly, his disappointment clear as Darius spoke again, his tone calm yet uncompromising. "Miss Calloway, you will personally ensure my children receive the same service that every other first-class passenger is given. You will publicly apologize to them in front of the cabin, and when this flight lands, you will explain yourself to the executive board." I could feel my blood boil at the cruelty of it all. Miss Calloway's hands trembled as she mustered a reply. "I understand." Darius's final good came with a finality that left no room for negotiation, and the call ended with a soft click. Captain Rowe leaned forward and, adjusting his headset, said sternly, "You heard the man, now fix your mistake." With that, Miss Calloway exited the cockpit, turning on her heel as she returned through the first-class cabin. I watched as passengers who moments ago had been indifferent or busy with their own affairs now turned their eyes toward her in curiosity and quiet judgment. When she reached our row, my heart sank further as I saw her hesitate. Every part of her seemed to want to vanish and escape this moment entirely, but she had no choice. Taking a deep breath, she looked at me and Ziair with eyes that barely concealed her inner turmoil and said in a voice forced to sound even, "I need to apologize to both of you." I barely looked up, still seething with a mix of anger and hurt that had been building inside me. Miss Calloway ran her fingers along the edge of the armrest as she continued, "I made an assumption, and I was wrong." Ziair, ever so perceptive, shifted in his seat, while I met her gaze squarely, demanding more than a perfunctory apology. "Are you apologizing because you truly mean it, or just because you got caught?" I asked quietly, though firmly. I could see a lump forming in her throat as she faltered. For years she had wielded control and commanded respect, but now she seemed stripped of her power. Her silence said more than any words could, and I knew that she was struggling to muster any genuine remorse. The silence stretched painfully between us as she stood there with her hands clenched tightly and her lips pressed into a thin line. It was clear that her apology was as hollow as it was forced. I then asked, in a calm yet cutting tone, "I was wrong to ask you to leave. I should have had my tickets verified before making any assumptions." My words were measured, but the underlying message was unmistakable. I was not willing to accept a half-hearted apology. Ms. Calloway's fingers twitched as she absorbed my words. I had been the one treated like an intruder, the one whose dignity was trampled on without a second thought, and her forced contrition did little to soothe that raw wound. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Ziair whispered, "Would you have done the same thing if we looked different?" The question hung in the air, heavy and accusatory. Ms. Calloway's throat went dry and she could not bring herself to answer. I watched her closely, and the flicker of hesitation in her eyes confirmed what I had long suspected. "You can't even say it," I murmured, shaking my head slightly. Those words were the final confirmation that she had never truly believed we belonged in first class in the first place. For years, she had trusted her instincts and her ability to judge, but today, she was forced to confront her own deep-seated bias. Her voice finally softened, and with a hint of genuine regret, she said, "I should not have judged you. I was wrong to assume you didn't belong here." Ziair looked up at me with a questioning gaze, and I took a moment to study her face for any sign of sincerity. "Okay," I said simply, leaning back in my seat with a quiet firmness that conveyed both resignation and lingering pain. I made it clear that words alone were not enough. "I don't need anything else from you," I added, and I could see her stomach sink with the weight of my dismissal. In that moment, I realized that I was not looking for grand gestures or elaborate apologies. I was looking for proof of change, an acknowledgement that actions speak louder than words. Ziair leaned over and whispered, "You don't want her to say more?" I exhaled slowly, tapping my fingers against the armrest as I replied, "It's not about what she says now, it's about what she does next." Miss Calloway hesitated, clearly struggling to find the strength to offer any further reparations. Finally, in a subdued tone, she said, "If there's anything you need during the flight, please let me know." Neither Ziair nor I responded, and with that she turned and walked away, her steps lacking the sharp decisiveness they once held. As she disappeared down the aisle, I could see Ziair release a long-held breath and lean closer to me. "Do you think she meant it?" he asked quietly. I was silent for a moment, my heart still heavy with the events that had unfolded. Finally, I sighed and said, "I don't know. I still don't feel right sitting here." I glanced around at the passengers, some still stealing furtive glances in our direction while others avoided our eyes entirely, and wondered whether the energy in the cabin had shifted out of guilt or merely awkward discomfort. I looked out the window, watching as the last of the daylight faded, and I felt a quiet resolve form inside me. This ordeal had stripped away the veneer of luxury and courtesy we had once expected, revealing instead the raw, unvarnished truth about human cruelty and the pain of being judged unfairly. Even as the hum of the cabin continued around us, I knew that this experience would leave its mark on both Ziair and me for a long time. We would carry the memory of that public humiliation and the cold, calculated cruelty of someone who once held power over our lives, and it would remind us to always demand not just words of apology, but actions that prove true change. After the bags were loaded onto the plane, my phone buzzed quietly in my lap. I quickly typed a message to Dad asking, "Dad, everything taken care of?" I had seen that Ms. Calloway had finally returned us to our seats after her forced apology, and although she had said all the right words, I couldn't shake the feeling that her apology was as hollow as the silence that now filled the cabin. My father's reply came almost immediately. "Me?" I apologized, not sure if she meant it, but yeah, we're back in our seats. Soon after, another message appeared. "Dad, good. Sit tight. This isn't over yet." My stomach fluttered with dread. Deep down, I sensed that he wasn't offering that reassurance for my sake, but as a warning that Miss Calloway's problems were far from resolved. I could tell that Miss Calloway believed that her public apology would put an end to everything, yet, as she moved briskly toward the galley with a troubled look on her face, it was clear that she felt no relief, only an unsettling emptiness that came from losing control. For years, she had ruled the cabin with an iron will, ensuring that everything ran exactly as it should. But today, her certainty had wavered. As she reached the counter to pour herself a cup of water, her hands trembled slightly, betraying the inner turmoil she desperately tried to hide. The sound of footsteps behind her made her tense immediately. I knew it was Hannah, the younger flight attendant with the red name tag, who had a knack for seeing beyond the polished surface of things. "Are you okay?" Hannah asked softly, leaning against the counter with a tone that was careful not to be too intrusive. Ms. Calloway's response was icy. "I don't need your concern," she snapped, her eyes narrowing as if warning me not to get involved. Hannah raised an eyebrow and replied, "It didn't sound like they accepted your apology." That stung, and Ms. Calloway shot Hannah a sharp look, as if to say that the matter was none of her business, but Hannah persisted. "Isn't it? I really have to ask, did you even check their tickets before pulling them out of their seats?" The question hung in the air, heavy with accusation. Miss Calloway's fingers tightened around the cup as she tried to form a response, but no words came. Hannah continued, her voice low yet piercing. You made them feel like they didn't belong. I remember how excited little Ziair looked when we first boarded. Now he won't even lift his eyes from his seat. Her words, delivered without any attempt to soften the blow, cut deep. "That's on you," Hannah added, shaking her head with genuine regret. In that moment, I could almost see the weight of every unspoken judgment bearing down on Ms. Calloway. The younger attendant sighed, pushing herself away from the counter. "You might have fixed this flight, but this isn't over for you, you know that, right?" Ms. Calloway said nothing in reply, her silence confirming that Hannah's words had struck a nerve. Left alone, she stood there gripping the edge of the counter, feeling for the first time in her long career that she might never feel truly in control again. Back in first class, I glanced over at Ziair. He had barely moved since Miss Calloway left our row. His fingers tapped absently against the armrest, and his expression was as unreadable as ever. I leaned over and softly asked, "Are you okay?" He hesitated before shrugging, "I don't know." Trying to reassure him, I reminded him, "Dad's handling it." Ziair nodded slowly but then murmured, "Yeah, but will it change anything?" Before I could reply, the intercom came to life with a crisp announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're preparing for takeoff. Flight attendants, please secure the cabin." The plane began to taxi, and Ziair straightened in his seat as if bracing himself for more unexpected turns. I scanned the cabin and noticed that the atmosphere in first class still felt different. Some passengers pretended that nothing had happened, their eyes fixed on their screens or books, while others stole discreet glances in our direction. I caught sight of a man in a tailored suit sitting across the aisle. He cleared his throat under his breath, muttering, "For what it's worth, that never should have happened." I turned slightly, and he looked away quickly, nodding stiffly before returning to his movie. His discomfort echoed my own inner disquiet. The plane lifted off into the sky, yet the heaviness in my chest refused to dissipate. As I watched the earth fall away below, another message flashed on my phone. "Dad, we land in 3 hours. I'll be waiting at the gate." I gripped the phone tighter, not entirely sure what Dad had planned next, but certain of one thing. Mrs. Calloway was not finished with her reckoning today. Settling back into my seat, I found my thoughts drifting endlessly over the events that had shattered our sense of belonging. Ziair, usually so animated and curious, barely touched the in-flight screen. Instead, he sat staring out the window at the drifting clouds as if lost in thought. The silence around us was heavy, punctuated by the occasional clink of a tray or the soft murmur of a conversation. It struck me as ironic that just moments before, when we were forcibly removed from the plane, no one had dared to speak up. Now that we were back, every passenger seemed to have an opinion, even if only silently. Not long after, another flight attendant, this time Hannah, approached our row with a gentle smile. "Would you like something to eat or anything to drink?" she asked kindly, her eyes flickering first toward Ziair and then toward me. Ziair shook his head, so I hesitated before saying, "Just some water for him." Hannah nodded and quickly retreated, only to return shortly with a glass of water that she set carefully on the tray in front of him. Ziair muttered a quiet thanks, but still kept his gaze fixed on the window. Hannah lingered for a moment as if weighing whether to add something more, and finally she spoke in a soft, remorseful tone. "I'm really sorry about what happened earlier." I raised an eyebrow and asked, "Are you saying that because you mean it, or just because you saw how everything unfolded?" Without flinching, Hannah replied, "Because I mean it." I nodded slowly, then pressed further. "Then why didn't you say anything before?" Hannah looked down and, after a slow exhale, admitted, "I've seen things like this happen before, and I always told myself it wasn't my place to interfere. But that doesn't make it right." I didn't have an answer, but her honesty gave me a small measure of hope in the midst of our ongoing ordeal. I then turned to Ziair and asked, "You work with her, don't you?" Hannah confirmed with a nod, "Yes, she's been here longer than I have. Most people don't question her decisions," Hannah continued, almost wistfully. "I used to be one of those people, but not anymore." I tilted my head, absorbing her words, and replied, "At least you're being honest about it." Hannah smiled slightly and said, "If you need anything, just let me know." I offered a quiet thanks, and as Hannah walked away, I noticed for the first time that Ziair had finally looked up and asked, "Do you believe her?" I sighed. "I don't know, maybe. At least she said something." He pressed his lips together in contemplation, and I added softly, "Yeah, but she only said it when it was safe to." The unspoken truth hung between us as the flight continued and the minutes dragged on. I found myself scrolling through messages from friends on my phone, their words oblivious to the events unfolding above the aisle. Ziair eventually pulled up a movie on his screen, though it was clear his mind wasn't on the film at all. Then suddenly the intercom crackled once more. "Miss Calloway, please report to the cockpit immediately." My heart skipped a beat as I glanced toward the front of the cabin. Ziair frowned and muttered, "Again?" Around us, passengers exchanged curious glances. Even Hannah, busy earlier with her rounds, paused mid-step. I folded my arms and thought, Dad must be handling things already. Ziair blinked. "But we're still in the air," I replied firmly. "Exactly." We watched as Miss Calloway, now looking even more rigid and tense, made her way toward the front, disappearing behind the curtain that led to the cockpit. The moment she was gone, a ripple of whispers passed through first class. Some passengers leaned toward one another, murmuring softly, while others looked at us with a mix of pity and silent judgment. They were no longer just looking at two kids who had been treated unfairly. They were witnessing the fallout from a man's influence that reached even into the skies. Ziair's wide eyes met mine as he whispered, "What do you think's happening up there?" I managed a small, rueful smirk, replying, "I think Miss Calloway just realized this is a lot bigger than she thought." For the first time since boarding, I felt the balance of power shift noticeably. Miss Calloway's heavy footsteps and labored breath as she stepped into the cockpit were a reminder that even the most confident person can be brought low. The door closed with a quiet click behind her, and the enclosed space suddenly felt much smaller than usual. Captain Rowe sat in his chair with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable as the tension of the moment settled over the cockpit. And though I couldn't see what happened next, I knew deep down that the consequences of today's events were far from over. I still remember that fateful moment when the hum of the cockpit instruments was interrupted by a voice so calm yet so weighty that it froze the very air around us. I was sitting in my first-class seat, trying to steady my racing heart, when I heard Captain Rowe's voice through the in-flight phone. Even though he kept his focus on the instruments, the stiffness in his posture betrayed his awareness of what was unfolding behind him. Then came that voice. Darius Holloway's voice, clear and controlled, resonating with an authority that made the cabin feel even heavier. "Zach Calloway," he said, "I assume you now understand exactly how badly you miscalculated today." At that moment, my anger and sorrow mingled with a deep, unyielding sense of justice. I knew my father's name carried more weight than any mere complaint. He was the man who built this airline from scratch, and his words were not open to negotiation. In the cockpit, Miss Calloway tried to speak. "Sir, she began, but Darius cut her off sharply. "Don't bother. I'm not interested in excuses." Captain Rowe leaned forward slightly, his eyes locked on her as if to say that no further argument was acceptable. "Corporate has already been informed of what happened," he stated in a firm tone. "Mr. Holloway has requested an immediate review of your conduct upon landing." I could almost feel the color draining from her face through the small window that separated the cockpit from our view. A review? The very thought made my blood boil. Darius's voice returned, steady and chilling in its simplicity. "I own this airline, Ms. Calloway, which means when a situation like this happens, I have the authority to ensure it's handled properly. And believe me, it will be." I listened, my heart aching with a mixture of vindication and pity as she clutched the edge of the nearest seat for support. "Sir, I acknowledge my mistake, but Do you?" she managed to say, her voice trembling. Darius continued, "Because I have reports from passengers, your fellow crew members, and even the captain that suggest you didn't think it was a mistake at all, until you were forced to correct it." His words were measured but full of a biting truth. Captain Rowe's expression grew sterner as he added, "Ms. Calloway, you didn't just embarrass 2 passengers, you embarrassed this airline." I felt a surge of relief knowing that someone was holding her accountable, even as my heart ached for the injustice that had been inflicted on my younger brother Ziair and on me. Darius's tone softened just a fraction as he continued, "You didn't question any other first-class passengers. You didn't stop anyone else to check their tickets, just my children. I wonder why." I knew exactly why, and even as I sat there I felt a deep, resonant sadness for the cruelty of it all. Ms. Calloway's fingers clenched into fists at her sides as she attempted to muster a response, stammering, I wasn't thinking." Darius's reply was as cold as it was definitive. "No, you were not thinking. You simply weren't thinking correctly." I could sense that the weight of these words was crushing her, but there was no redemption in them, only the harsh reality of her misjudgment. Captain Rowe then inquired, "Mr. Holloway, what would you like us to do before landing?" Darius's answer came without hesitation. "Mr. Calloway, you will personally see to it that my children receive the highest level of service for the remainder of this flight, not because I care about their comfort, they already know they belong in first class, but because I want the rest of the passengers to see what it looks like when someone is forced to acknowledge their mistake." The humiliation in those words burned through the cabin like a searing flame, and I could feel every ounce of my pain, every drop of indignation mix with a strange sense of satisfaction that justice was being served, even if it was in a way that left a bitter taste in my mouth. Then came the final blow. "Upon landing," Darius declared, "security will be waiting for you at the gate. You will be escorted directly to the executive office, where you will explain yourself to the board. If your explanation is unsatisfactory, you will no longer be employed by this airline." The call ended with a sharp click that echoed in the silent tension of the cockpit. I sat there, my heart pounding, as I tried to process the enormity of what had just been said. Miss Calloway, once so imperious and self-assured, now stood frozen, her authority shattered like fragile glass. Captain Rowe's voice broke the heavy silence as he said, "You should get back to the cabin. I suggest you make good use of the time you have left." With those words, Miss Calloway nodded stiffly and stepped out of the cockpit. As she re-entered the cabin, I could immediately feel the weight of every passenger's stare, each one laden with a mix of judgment and morbid curiosity. Back in first class, I, the new Eleanor, now the one who had borne the brunt of this injustice, sat quietly, scrolling through my phone, while my younger brother Ziair tried to distract himself with a movie that clearly did little to lift his spirits. The cabin itself felt transformed. Passengers whispered in subdued tones, their eyes darting between us and the slowly reformed Ms. Calloway as she made her way down the aisle. When she finally emerged, she moved slowly and deliberately, her posture stiff with the burden of her own disgrace. At our row, she paused, taking a measured breath before speaking in a voice that was as controlled as it was brittle. "Can I offer you anything? Drinks, a meal, anything at all?" she asked, her tone polite yet devoid of any warmth. I studied her face, reading the forced politeness and the unmistakable stiffness in her movements. It was clear to me that this was not a sincere attempt at making amends. It was merely a survival tactic, a desperate effort to cling to the remnants of her former authority. I couldn't hold back any longer. In a measured tone that masked the hurt and anger roiling within me, I said, "You didn't ask us that when we first sat down. I'd like to correct that now." I looked at her steadily and added, "Would you be doing this if my last name wasn't Holloway?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and for a brief moment I saw a flicker of shame in her eyes, a small crack in the mask of indifference she had so carefully constructed. "No," she murmured quietly, as if answering for herself before I could press further. Ziair, sitting next to me, let out a tired sigh. "I'll just take some juice," he muttered, his voice low and defeated. Miss Calloway nodded stiffly and turned, disappearing briefly toward the galley. I watched her go, feeling an odd mix of pity and triumph. It wasn't just that she had been forced to apologize. It was that she was now the one on trial, her every move scrutinized by the very people she had once commanded. I could almost sense her thoughts as she returned with a small cup of juice, which she placed with trembling precision on Ziair's tray. Her forced smile was a poor substitute for genuine remorse, and I knew in that instant that she was not truly sorry. She was scared. Scared of losing her job, scared of the judgment, and scared of the realization that she had been wrong all along. Every step she took through the cabin now seemed to echo with the sound of countless whispers and stifled giggles. I could see the passengers' eyes following her, some filled with a smug sense of satisfaction, others with quiet pity. For the first time, she was the one who didn't belong. For the first time, the tables had turned and the powerful were forced to face the consequences of their cruelty. I watched her move among the passengers, her professional facade crumbling under the weight of her shame. In every glance and every whispered comment, I sensed a silent verdict. She had lost. I continued to sit there, feeling the bittersweet relief of having seen justice done, even as the damage of her earlier cruelty lingered in the cold air of the cabin. Ziair sipped his juice quietly, his eyes not quite meeting mine, and I knew that the excitement we had once felt at the prospect of flying first class had been replaced by a heavy, unyielding sorrow. The flight, which should have been a simple journey to our destination, had transformed into a stage for a painful lesson in power and prejudice. I could feel the lingering weight of Ms. Calloway's humiliation as I watched her retreat toward the galley, her shoulders hunched in defeat. For a long while after that, I sat quietly, my mind reeling with the injustice of it all. I couldn't help but reflect on how quickly someone who had once held all the power could be brought low by the unyielding truth. Ms. Calloway had ruled this cabin with an iron fist, but now she was forced to experience the vulnerability and humiliation that comes when one's own actions are laid bare for everyone to see. I felt both sorrow and a hard-won satisfaction, knowing that her cruelty had been met with the full force of accountability. Yet the pain of our mistreatment, the way I had been made to feel so small and unwanted, would not easily fade from memory. As the plane steadied in the sky and the soft murmur of the engines filled the cabin, I clutched my phone and read another message from Dad. "We land in 3 hours. I'll be waiting at the gate." That simple reassurance was a reminder that even though today had been filled with public humiliation and bitter confrontations, there was still a promise of care and protection waiting for us on the ground. I took a deep breath and tried to focus on the gentle rhythm of the flight, even as the weight of the day's events pressed down on me. In that moment, I realized that while Ms. Calloway's apology might have been a hollow echo of forced words, it was also a clear signal that no one was above accountability, not even someone who once ruled the skies. And as I glanced around at the quiet, watchful eyes of the other passengers, I knew that this flight would forever be etched in my memory as a lesson in the true cost of cruelty and the bitter price of power misused. I looked around and noticed that even now some of the passengers still looked up as Miss Calloway passed by, whispering quietly among themselves. It was clear that not only had she lost control, but she had also lost the respect of everyone on board. My phone buzzed again with another message from Dad. "Dad, landing in 2 hours. Security is set. Sit tight." I exhaled slowly and wondered if Miss Calloway even realized what was waiting for her when we landed. My younger brother Ziair shifted in his seat and, in a soft, uncertain voice, said, "I kind of feel bad for her." I turned my head slightly and asked, "Why?" He hesitated a moment before replying, "I don't know. She looks nervous, like she knows she messed up." I studied him carefully, knowing full well that Ziair had always been more gentle and more willing to see the best in people even when they did not deserve it. I told him quietly, "That doesn't change what she did," he admitted softly. "I know. But what if she really is sorry?" I sighed and said, "Then she'll show it when no one is forcing her to." Although Ziair nodded slowly, I could tell he wasn't completely convinced. Not long after, Ms. Calloway returned to our row one last time and asked in a stiff, rehearsed tone, "Would either of you like a blanket or a pillow?" I did not answer immediately. I simply looked at her very carefully. The woman standing in front of me was no longer the Ms. Calloway who had ordered us off the plane with such harsh confidence and certainty. The old Ms. Calloway had been sure of herself, completely in control, but this woman now clearly understood that she had lost her authority. I said simply, "No." She nodded as if relieved to be dismissed and turned to walk away without another word. Ziair sighed softly. "I still feel bad," he murmured, and I replied quietly, "You don't have to feel bad. I made my choice. I just don't like the consequences." Ziair fell silent after that, and I returned my gaze to the window, watching the sky stretch endlessly before us. In less than 2 hours we would land, and I knew that for Ms. Calloway, her real problems were just beginning. The 2-hour stretch in the air felt interminable, especially as the cabin lights dimmed slightly to signal the approach of evening. Most of the passengers had settled into their seats, some lost in their books, others watching movies or even dozing off. The quiet hum of the engines filled the space, yet beneath that gentle sound, a tension lingered like a heavy shadow. I kept checking the time on the screen in front of me, watching the estimated arrival time adjust by a few minutes now and then. In less than 2 hours we would land, and with that landing, Ms. Calloway would have to face the reality she had spent the entire flight trying to ignore. Ziair, who usually was animated and engaged with every little detail of the flight, had finally curled up against his seat in a half-asleep state. I could tell by the way his foot still tapped lightly against the floor and the way his fingers fidgeted with the sleeve of his hoodie that he was not truly at ease. Neither was I. My father had told me to sit tight, but I knew him well enough to understand that whatever he had planned for Ms. Calloway, it was not going to be simple. My father, Darius Holloway, was not a man who acted impulsively. He never raised his voice or issued empty threats. He preferred to move in silence and let consequences speak for themselves. And right now, Ms. Calloway had no idea what was waiting for her when we landed. Across the aisle, a soft voice broke through the quiet. "I just want to say, I'm really sorry for what happened to you two." I turned my head and saw an older woman. She had spoken up after we were forced back on the plane, sitting 2 rows across from us, with her reading glasses perched delicately on her nose and a gentle expression on her face. I studied her carefully and asked, "Why are you sorry?" The woman hesitated for a moment, folding her hands in her lap before admitting softly, "Because I was sitting right here when it happened, and I didn't say anything." Her words made my chest tighten a little. The woman exhaled slowly as if she were working through her thoughts, then continued, "I saw the way that flight attendant looked at you before she even spoke. I saw the way she questioned you, but didn't question anyone else. And I knew deep down it wasn't right." Her voice carried a sorrowful honesty that was different from the scripted apologies we had heard from the airline staff. I listened, feeling a mixture of empathy and regret. I expected an apology from Ms. Calloway, from corporate, even from other crew members, I said quietly. But I didn't expect this from someone who stayed silent until now, I added softly. "You were scared." The older woman's face flushed slightly, but she nodded in agreement. "I was," she admitted. "I was scared of causing a scene, of getting involved in something I thought wasn't my place." I studied her carefully, noting that she was not like Miss Calloway at all. There was no forced apology or rehearsed line in her words. This was real. At that moment, my younger brother stirred beside me, rubbing his eyes and asking in a sleepy tone, "What's going on?" The woman smiled gently at him and said, "I was just telling your sister that I should have spoken up sooner." Ziair blinked sleepily, then shrugged, and the woman smiled softly. "Well, you're saying it now, and I suppose that's something." I nodded slightly, my expression unreadable as I considered the weight of her words. After the conversation, I turned back toward the front of the cabin. I saw Ms. Calloway reappearing, but she was no longer moving through the aisle with her usual assured grace. Instead, she lingered near the curtain that separated first class from the rest of the plane, hesitating for just a fraction of a second before forcing herself to continue. Her eyes darted nervously toward the passengers, but then she quickly looked away, as if she could feel their judgment. It was as though she sensed that her presence had shifted from being that of a respected authority to one of whispered disgrace. She had already been judged in the court of public opinion, and in that moment, it was clear that she had lost. Soon after, Hannah, the younger flight attendant with the red name tag, passed by, heading toward our row with an expression that was almost knowing. "I wanted to check in on you too," she said quietly, offering a small smile. "How are you feeling?" Ziair simply shrugged, looking tired, while I responded with a quiet, "Fine." Hannah nodded and said, "I know today didn't go how it should have." She hesitated for a moment and then glanced briefly toward the front of the plane, where Miss Calloway was now pretending to organize the meal trays. Lowering her voice, she admitted, "I don't know what's going to happen to her when we land, but I do know she's never had to answer for anything like this before." I tilted my head slightly and asked, "And that bothers you?" Hannah exhaled and said, "It's complicated." I shook my head and replied simply, "No, it's not. Actions speak for themselves." Hannah gave a soft, knowing smile and said, "Well, let me know if you need anything before landing." With that, she stepped back and I turned towards Ziair, who was watching the exchange quietly. In a low voice, he asked, "Do you think she really means it?" I considered his question carefully and finally said, "Maybe." After a moment of silence, Ziair added, "Dad's gonna fire her, isn't he?" I did not answer immediately. Instead, I turned my gaze toward Ms. Calloway as she moved through the cabin with the same forced grace. I murmured quietly, "Yeah, I think he is." For the first time, I wasn't sure whether that outcome was enough, but it was clear that Ms. Calloway wasn't just losing her job, she was losing the reputation and respect she had built over the years, and that might hurt more than anything else. As the final hour of the flight dragged on, the tension in the cabin grew thicker. Miss Calloway had retreated to the galley, avoiding unnecessary interactions, likely trying desperately to salvage what little dignity she had left. I could feel the shift in the atmosphere, not only in the way the passengers reacted, but also in the way the crew carried themselves. No one spoke openly about what had happened, yet it hovered in the air like an unshakable weight. Ziair had finally started watching his movie, though I could tell his mind was still elsewhere. His fingers drummed lightly against his knee as if he were trying to work through his thoughts. I checked my phone again, but there were no new messages from my father. I already knew what awaited us at the gate: security, corporate executives, and a reckoning that would leave no room for excuses. Miss Calloway must have thought she had already been through the worst when she delivered that forced apology and endured the stares of every passenger. Yet I knew that her troubles were far from over. I could almost hear the sound of her heart sinking as she realized that her power had been stripped away completely. It wasn't just a matter of being reprimanded. It was a complete reversal of roles. In the space of one long, painful flight, she had gone from being the one who dictated order to being the one who would soon be held accountable for her actions. I glanced around at the other passengers. Some had gone back to their books or movies, trying to pretend as if nothing had happened, while others cast furtive glances in our direction, their eyes full of a mix of pity and quiet judgment. I felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow. Relief because the truth had finally come to light, and sorrow because the injustice my brother and I had suffered could never be entirely undone. As the cabin lights dimmed further and evening settled in, I watched Ziair's eyes grow heavy, though the slight tapping of his foot betrayed that his mind was still restless. My thoughts were interrupted by the soft murmur of the engines and another message from Dad that reminded me once again of the inevitable confrontation waiting for Ms. Calloway when we landed. Even as I tried to focus on the gentle rhythm of the flight, I could not shake the image of Ms. Calloway standing there near the curtain, her gaze downcast, as if aware that every whisper and every stolen glance from the passengers spelled out her impending disgrace. It was a painful lesson in the true cost of cruelty and the bitter price of misused power, and, as I sat there, I knew that this flight would remain etched in my memory forever.